During my beloved wife's funeral, as I stood at the podium sharing memories of our 42 years together, I heard something that made my blood run cold. From the third row, Derek's quiet snicker cut through the silence like a blade. When I mentioned how Maggie used to burn breakfast every Sunday morning, his whispered comment to his friend carried across the chapel. Thank God that's over with. What he didn't know was that the divorce papers sitting in my jacket pocket had already been signed by Lisa 3 days ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Catholic Church, casting colorful patterns across the polished wooden pews. I had stood at this same podium 23 years ago, watching Derek nervously adjust his tie as Lisa walked down the aisle in the wedding dress Maggie had spent months helping her choose. Today, the church felt different, heavier. The scent of lilies and roses from the dozens of floral arrangements couldn't mask the weight of grief that pressed down on everyone gathered to honor my wife's memory. Margaret Thompson had been the heart of Cedar Falls for 4 decades. She taught Sunday school, organized the annual church bake sale, and never missed a Little League game when our grandchildren were playing. The pews were packed with faces I'd known for years, neighbors who remembered Maggie's homemade apple pies cooling on windowsills, coworkers from the elementary school where she'd volunteered long after Lisa graduated, and family members who'd traveled from 3 states to say goodbye. I adjusted my reading glasses and looked down at the handwritten notes I'd prepared. Maggie would have laughed at my careful preparation. She always said I planned everything like I was still running the postal service with schedules and backup plans for the backup plans. But this was different. These words mattered. They might be the last ones I'd speak about the woman who'd shared my life since we were both 26 years old. Father Murphy had given me gentle encouragement before the service began. He'd known Maggie since we'd moved to Cedar Falls in 1987, and his own eyes were red-rimmed as he spoke about her kindness and devotion to family. The whole community felt her loss. Maggie had that rare quality of making everyone feel like they mattered, from the postal workers I supervised to the grocery store clerk she chatted with every Tuesday. Standing behind the wooden podium, I could see Lisa in the front row, her face streaked with tears, clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. Sophie and Ben sat on either side of their mother, 11-year-old Ben trying to be brave for his little sister, while 8-year-old Sophie pressed her face against Lisa's shoulder. My heart ached watching them process their grandmother's sudden passing. Maggie had suffered a massive heart attack while gardening in our backyard, gone before the ambulance could even reach Cedar Falls General Hospital. Derek sat beside them, but something about his posture felt wrong. While everyone else leaned forward, engaged in the memories I was sharing, he seemed detached. His phone buzzed twice during the opening prayer, and I'd watched him glance at it, despite Lisa's disapproving look. His expensive navy suit looked out of place among the more modest attire of our longtime neighbors. Everything about him screamed success and importance, from his perfectly styled hair to his Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most people in Cedar Falls spent on groceries in a month. Many of them had experienced Maggie's cooking firsthand at potluck dinners and church events. That's when I heard it. Derek's quiet snicker wasn't meant to be heard, but in the reverent silence of the church, it carried further than he realized. His whispered comment to his friend Jake Morrison, who'd driven down from Columbus, felt like a physical slap. Thank God that's over with. The words were barely audible, but they might as well have been shouted through a megaphone. I paused mid-sentence, my prepared words disappearing as I processed what I'd just heard. Around me, I could see other mourners shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door and had shared countless conversations with Maggie over the backyard fence, turned to look at Derek with obvious displeasure. My sister Janet, sitting 2 rows behind them, had heard it too. Her face went pale, then red with indignation. But I didn't react, not outwardly. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the manila envelope I'd placed there this morning. Inside were documents that would change everything for Derek Rodriguez, though he had no idea what was coming. 3 days ago, while he was closing a real estate deal in Columbus and playing golf with clients, Lisa had made a decision that would reshape their family forever. I continued with my eulogy, sharing memories of Maggie's garden, her terrible singing voice that never stopped her from joining the church choir, and her uncanny ability to remember every birthday, anniversary, and important moment in the lives of everyone she met. But part of my mind was elsewhere, thinking about the conversation I'd had with Lisa just 72 hours earlier. She'd arrived at my house on Tuesday evening, her eyes swollen from crying. I'd assumed she was simply overwhelmed by grief, struggling to plan a funeral while managing her own teaching responsibilities and taking care of Sophie and Ben. Maggie's death had been so sudden, so unexpected. None of us were prepared for the administrative nightmare that follows losing someone you love. But Lisa's tears weren't just about her mother's passing. She'd discovered something that shattered what remained of her world during an already devastating time. Derek's phone had been buzzing constantly since Maggie died, with what he claimed were work calls and messages from clients offering condolences. But when Lisa picked up his phone to charge it Tuesday morning, a notification had popped up that changed everything. A text message from someone named Amber. The preview was enough to make Lisa's stomach drop. "Can't wait for this weekend, baby. Tell your wife you have another work conference." The message was followed by a heart emoji and a photo that left no doubt about Derek and Amber's relationship. Lisa had scrolled through weeks of messages, each one more damning than the last. Derek had been carrying on an affair for at least 6 months, possibly longer. While Maggie was battling the heart condition that would eventually take her life, while Lisa was juggling teaching 4th grade and caring for 2 children, Derek was sneaking off to Columbus for romantic weekends with a 28-year-old mortgage broker from his office. The betrayal cut deep, but what devastated Lisa most was the timing. Derek had been planning to leave her. His messages to Amber revealed a calculated plan to divorce Lisa after the holidays, taking advantage of what he called optimal market conditions for dividing their assets. He'd been moving money around, consulting with lawyers, and positioning himself for a favorable settlement. Maggie's sudden death had simply accelerated his timeline. But Derek had underestimated the women in our family. Lisa Thompson had inherited her mother's gentle demeanor, but she'd also inherited my methodical approach to problem solving. Instead of confronting Derek immediately, she had spent Tuesday afternoon making phone calls of her own. By Wednesday morning, she'd consulted with Murphy & Associates, the most respected law firm in Cedar Falls. By Wednesday afternoon, she'd filed for divorce, citing infidelity and emotional abandonment. The papers were served to Derek at his office on Thursday morning, just hours before we were scheduled to finalize Maggie's funeral arrangements. He'd called Lisa in a rage, demanding explanations and threatening legal action. But his threats rang hollow when she calmly mentioned that she had copies of every message, every hotel receipt, and every piece of evidence documenting his affair. Derek had tried to negotiate, claiming the affair meant nothing, promising to end it immediately. He'd begged for Lisa's forgiveness, insisting that grief had clouded his judgment. But Lisa had made her decision. She wanted him out of the house by the weekend, and she wanted their marriage dissolved as quickly as Ohio state law would allow. Standing at that podium, watching Derek fidget in his seat while completely unaware that his life was about to implode, I felt a strange mixture of grief and satisfaction. Maggie would have been heartbroken to learn about Derek's betrayal, but she also would have been proud of Lisa's strength. My daughter had learned from her mother's example that family loyalty and respect weren't negotiable values. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I concluded my eulogy by talking about Maggie's legacy, how she'd taught us all that love required daily choices, small acts of kindness, and unwavering commitment to the people who mattered most. The congregation nodded along, many wiping away tears as I described how Maggie had modeled devotion and service throughout her life. Derek checked his phone again during my closing words. I wondered if Amber was texting him, asking about his availability for their planned weekend getaway. He had no idea that his secret life was about to become very public knowledge in Cedar Falls. In a town of 12,000 people, news traveled fast, and Derek's reputation as a successful family man was about to crumble. After the service ended, mourners filed slowly toward the fellowship hall, where church volunteers had prepared a meal. Derek immediately excused himself to take a phone call, stepping outside where he thought no one could hear him. But Mrs. Chen had followed him, curious about his behavior during the service. She returned to the fellowship hall with raised eyebrows and whispered conversations with other longtime church members. Lisa stood beside Maggie's casket, accepting condolences from friends and neighbors. Sophie and Ben clung to their mother, overwhelmed by the sea of adult emotions and formal procedures. I watched Derek return from his phone call, smoothing his hair and checking his reflection in his phone's camera before rejoining his family. He placed a proprietary hand on Lisa's shoulder, playing the role of supportive husband for the benefit of everyone watching. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek was performing grief and devotion for a community that would soon learn the truth about his character. He'd spent months planning his exit strategy, calculating how to minimize his financial losses while maximizing his personal freedom. But he'd miscalculated badly. He'd forgotten that actions have consequences, and that deceiving people who trust you always comes with a price. Janet approached me as the crowd began to thin out. My sister had been Maggie's closest friend for over 40 years, and her face still showed the shock of overhearing Derek's inappropriate comment during the eulogy. She leaned close, speaking in the low voice reserved for serious family conversations. "Harold, did you hear what that boy said during your speech?" Her words dripped with disgust. "I've never liked him, but I thought even Derek would show proper respect at Maggie's funeral." I nodded slowly, patting the envelope in my jacket pocket. "I heard it, Janet, and he's going to learn that disrespecting our family has consequences." Derek was across the room, chatting with Jake Morrison about some business opportunity in Columbus. His animated gestures and casual laughter felt obscene in the context of a funeral reception. He'd already mentally moved on from mourning his mother-in-law to planning his next career move. But his carefree attitude was about to disappear. Robert Harrison, my former coworker and closest friend, joined our conversation. Bob had worked alongside me at the Postal Service for 15 years, and he'd witnessed Derek's transformation from grateful son-in-law to entitled opportunist. When Derek and Lisa first married, Derek had been genuinely appreciative of our family's acceptance and support, but success had changed him. The more money he made in real estate, the less he seemed to value the relationships that had helped him build that success. "That young man's got some nerve," Bob muttered, glancing toward Derek. "Maggie treated him like her own son for 23 years, and he acts like her death is an inconvenience." Bob didn't know about the divorce papers or Derek's affair, but his instincts about Derek's character were sound. Derek had been pulling away from family obligations for months, missing Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations because of work commitments that Lisa was now learning had been fabricated excuses to spend time with Amber. The afternoon stretched on with typical funeral rituals. Casseroles were distributed, photos were shared, and stories were told about Maggie's impact on everyone's lives. Derek participated when necessary, but kept glancing at his watch and checking his phone. His impatience was becoming obvious to anyone paying attention. Around 4 o'clock, Derek approached Lisa with the apologetic expression he'd perfected over the years. He explained that he needed to drive back to Columbus that evening to handle an urgent client situation. The excuse was smooth and practiced, delivered with just enough regret to seem believable. Lisa simply nodded, not bothering to challenge his obvious lie. What Derek didn't realize was that Lisa had already changed the locks on their house. His belongings were packed in boxes and waiting in the garage. His key wouldn't work when he returned from his romantic weekend with Amber, and the neighbors would have front-row seats to his confusion and embarrassment. As the reception wound down, I helped Lisa gather the children and prepare for the cemetery service. Maggie would be laid to rest in Riverside Memorial Gardens, where we'd already purchased plots side by side. The thought of visiting that grave alone for the rest of my life felt overwhelming, but I drew strength from knowing that Maggie would approve of how we were handling Derek's betrayal. The envelope in my pocket seemed to grow heavier as the day progressed. Those divorce papers represented the end of a 23-year marriage, the dissolution of what everyone in Cedar Falls had considered a stable, successful family. But they also represented Lisa's courage and determination to protect herself and her children from further deception. Derek had gambled that his secret life would remain hidden until he was ready to reveal it on his own terms. He'd calculated the costs and benefits of divorce like any other business transaction, assuming he could control the timeline and minimize the damage to his reputation. But he'd forgotten that marriages aren't just contracts between two people. They're commitments witnessed and supported by entire communities. In Cedar Falls, family meant something. Neighbors watched out for each other, and betraying that trust came with social consequences that couldn't be quantified in financial terms. Derek was about to learn that his actions didn't just affect Lisa and the children, they affected everyone who'd welcomed him into their community and treated him with respect and affection. As we prepared to leave St. Mary's for the cemetery, I took one last look at the church where Maggie and I had worshipped for 37 years. This building had witnessed our daughter's wedding, our grandchildren's baptisms, and countless Sunday mornings when our family filled an entire pew. Today it had witnessed Derek's final act of disrespect toward the woman who'd treated him like a son. The manila envelope crinkled slightly as I adjusted my jacket. Soon, Derek would discover that his careful plans had been derailed by his own arrogance and timing. The divorce papers waiting in my pocket were just the beginning of consequences that would reshape his life in ways he couldn't imagine. But that revelation would have to wait. First, we had to lay Maggie to rest with the dignity and respect she deserved. The reckoning Derek had earned would come soon enough. The cemetery service passed in a blur of autumn leaves and final prayers. As Father Murphy spoke the traditional words of committal, I watched Derek glance repeatedly at his phone, his impatience growing more obvious by the minute. The man couldn't even show proper respect during the final moments of laying his mother-in-law to rest. When the service concluded, he made his excuses about the urgent Columbus client meeting and hurried away from the graveside before the last flowers were placed on Maggie's casket. That evening, alone in the house that still smelled faintly of Maggie's lavender sachets, I sat in my study going through the documents Lisa had brought me 3 days earlier. The evidence of Derek's betrayal filled an entire manila folder. Screenshots of text messages spanning 6 months, hotel receipts charged to his business credit card, restaurant bills for romantic dinners he'd claimed were client meetings, and most damning of all, emails to Amber discussing their future together once he divorced Lisa. Derek Rodriguez had been methodical in his deception. He'd opened a separate checking account, slowly transferring money from their joint savings under the guise of business investments. He'd consulted with a divorce attorney in Columbus, someone who didn't know our family or the Cedar Falls community. His plan had been calculated and cold, designed to minimize his financial obligations while maximizing his personal freedom. But Derek had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the strength of the woman he'd married and the family that had welcomed him. Lisa Thompson had always been gentle and trusting, qualities that Derek had exploited for years. But when pushed beyond her breaking point, she'd shown the same quiet determination that had carried our family through decades of challenges. The phone calls started on Saturday morning. Derek's voice carried confusion and mounting panic as he tried to understand why his house key wouldn't work. Lisa had changed the locks at 8 o'clock Friday evening, just hours after Derek left for his supposed business meeting. His belongings waited in neatly packed boxes in the garage, accessible through the side door that Lisa had left unlocked for his convenience. By noon, Derek was demanding explanations. His carefully controlled persona cracked as he realized that his secret had been exposed and his comfortable life was crumbling. The affair with Amber had been discovered, his financial manipulations documented, and his reputation in Cedar Falls about to face devastating scrutiny. Lisa's voice remained steady throughout their phone conversations. She calmly explained that she'd filed for divorce, that she had legal representation, and that his attempts at negotiation were futile. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his behavior at Maggie's funeral had eliminated any possibility of reconciliation. Derek tried every manipulation tactic he'd perfected over the years. He blamed stress from work, claimed the affair was meaningless, and accused Lisa of overreacting during a time of grief. But his arguments fell flat against the weight of documented deception and his own arrogant assumption that he could control the situation.
Cedar Falls was a small community where personal character mattered as much as business success. Clients who'd trusted Derek with their real estate transactions started questioning whether someone who'd deceive his own family could be trusted with their financial futures. 2 major listings were withdrawn by Monday morning, and several pending deals fell through when sellers learned about his marital problems. The revelation of his affair shocked people who'd considered Derek a devoted family man. For 23 years, he'd played the role perfectly, attending school events for Sophie and Ben, participating in church activities, and presenting himself as a successful husband and father. The discovery that his entire public persona had been a carefully constructed lie left neighbors and friends feeling betrayed and foolish. Lisa's strength throughout the crisis surprised everyone, including herself. She continued teaching her 4th-grade class, maintained normal routines for Sophie and Ben, and handled the legal proceedings with quiet dignity. Her students noticed that Mrs. Rodriguez seemed sadder than usual, but her professionalism never wavered. Parents who learned about her situation offered support and admiration for her grace under pressure. The children struggled with the sudden upheaval in their lives. Ben, at 11, understood enough to feel angry at his father's betrayal. Sophie, at 8, was confused about why Daddy couldn't come home and why Mommy cried when she thought no one was watching. Both children found comfort in spending extra time with me, their grandfather who represented stability in their suddenly uncertain world. Derek's attempts to maintain his relationship with Sophie and Ben were complicated by his own choices. His weekend visitation rights were supervised initially, partly because of his unstable housing situation and partly because Lisa didn't trust him to prioritize the children's emotional needs over his own convenience. Derek rented a small apartment in Columbus, claiming it was temporary while he sorted out his personal situation, but everyone understood he was choosing proximity to Amber over maintaining connections with his children. The financial consequences of Derek's deception became apparent as lawyers examined the couple's assets. His secret account contained nearly $30,000 that should have been part of their joint savings. His business credit card showed expenses that had nothing to do with legitimate client entertainment. The pattern of financial dishonesty extended back over 2 years, suggesting that Derek's planning for divorce had begun long before he'd started his affair with Amber. Legal proceedings moved swiftly in Derek's case. His own attorney advised him to accept Lisa's terms rather than fight a battle he couldn't win. The evidence of infidelity and financial deception made his position indefensible, and prolonged litigation would only increase his costs and further damage his reputation. Derek agreed to a settlement that gave Lisa primary custody of the children, the family home, and the majority of their shared assets. By Thanksgiving, Derek's transformation from respected family man to community pariah was complete. His real estate career in Cedar Falls was effectively finished, forcing him to focus entirely on the Columbus market, where his personal life was less well known. His relationship with Amber continued, but the stress of divorce proceedings and professional setbacks strained even their connection. Lisa discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed. Managing single parenthood while maintaining her teaching career required careful organization and community support, but she found both in abundance. Church members, school colleagues, and longtime neighbors rallied around her family, providing practical help and emotional encouragement. The same community that had witnessed Derek's betrayal now celebrated Lisa's resilience. Christmas arrived with new traditions and adjusted expectations.
Sophie and Ben spent Christmas Eve with Derek in his Columbus apartment, but Christmas morning found them back home in Cedar Falls, opening presents under the tree Lisa had decorated herself. The absence of Derek's expensive gifts was offset by the presence of genuine joy and family connection that had been missing for months while Derek planned his escape. 3 months after Maggie's funeral, I stood in the same cemetery placing fresh flowers on her grave. The winter wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of spring's eventual return. Maggie would have been heartbroken by Derek's betrayal, but she would have been proud of Lisa's strength and the way our family had pulled together during crisis. Derek's disrespectful laugh during Maggie's eulogy had revealed his true character at the worst possible moment. His assumption that grief would provide cover for his continued deception had backfired spectacularly. The divorce papers that had been waiting in my jacket pocket during that funeral service had represented more than legal documents. They had represented justice, accountability, and the restoration of dignity to our family. Lisa had learned that respect couldn't be demanded or assumed, only earned through consistent actions over time. Derek had spent years taking her trust for granted, assuming that his financial contributions gave him permission to treat her and their marriage as conveniences rather than sacred commitments. His betrayal had been a gift in disguise, freeing Lisa from a relationship built on deception and opening possibilities for a future based on honesty and mutual respect. The community of Cedar Falls had also learned important lessons about the difference between public image and private character. Derek's polished exterior had masked a selfish and dishonest nature that ultimately couldn't withstand scrutiny. His fall from grace served as a reminder that true success required integrity, and that betraying the trust of people who loved you always carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate relationships. Standing beside Maggie's grave that cold December morning, I felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. My wife's death had revealed the worst in Derek Rodriguez, but it had also revealed the best in our daughter and our community. The man who had laughed during Maggie's eulogy had learned that disrespecting our family came with the price he hadn't calculated. The divorce papers might have been signed before that funeral service, but justice had been served in the months that followed, restoring honor to our family name and teaching everyone involved that actions have consequences that can't be escaped or manipulated away. Monday morning brought Derek's world crashing down with surgical precision. The locks had been changed, his belongings boxed and waiting in the garage, but that was only the beginning of his unraveling. At Rodriguez Realty, his secretary handed him 3 message slips before he'd even reached his office. The Hendersons had called to withdraw their listing. The Patels wanted to terminate their buyer's agreement. Mrs. Foster, whose Victorian home Derek had been marketing for 6 months, demanded an immediate meeting to discuss concerns about his professional conduct. Derek's hands trembled as he dialed the Hendersons' number first. Tom Henderson's voice was cold and direct. Word had spread through Cedar Falls about Derek's behavior at the funeral, and more importantly, about the circumstances surrounding his separation from Lisa. Tom had known Maggie Thompson for 15 years through the Lions Club, and the idea of someone disrespecting her memory was unforgivable. "We can't work with someone who treats his own family that way," Tom explained matter-of-factly. "If you'll cheat on your wife, what's to stop you from cheating us on commission rates or property disclosures?" The logic was devastating in its simplicity.
Personal character and professional integrity weren't separate compartments in a small town like Cedar Falls. Derek had built his reputation on being the reliable family man who understood community values. That foundation was crumbling beneath his feet, and every phone call made the damage more apparent. By Tuesday, Derek's office phone had stopped ringing entirely. His usual stream of referrals from satisfied clients dried up as word spread about his marital troubles and financial deception. The coffee shop conversations that once praised his business acumen now questioned his honesty and reliability. Real estate was built on trust, and Derek had shattered his credibility in the community where he'd worked for over a decade. Jake Morrison, Derek's friend from Columbus who'd witnessed the funeral incident, called Wednesday morning with uncomfortable news. The story had spread beyond Cedar Falls. Real estate agents gossiped like any other profession, and Derek's reputation was becoming toxic throughout the entire Southwest Ohio market. Potential clients were asking pointed questions about his personal life, and established agents were distancing themselves from association with his name. The financial pressure mounted quickly. Derek's income had dropped to nearly zero within a week, but his expenses remained the same. The Columbus apartment rent, his car payment, restaurants with Amber, and legal fees created a crushing burden that his emergency savings couldn't sustain. The $30,000 he'd hidden from Lisa wouldn't last 2 months if his business didn't recover, and recovery seemed increasingly unlikely. Lisa, meanwhile, was discovering an unexpected strength in handling crisis. Her teaching salary had always been supplemental income while Derek provided the majority of their financial support, but now she was forced to budget carefully and make every dollar count. The mortgage payment on their Cedar Falls home was manageable without Derek's expensive lifestyle additions, and the community support made many daily challenges easier to navigate. Mrs. Chen brought homemade soup twice a week, claiming she'd made too much for one person. Bob Harrison shoveled Lisa's driveway without being asked and refused payment for the service. Father Murphy organized an informal network of church members who provided childcare when Lisa needed to attend legal meetings or handled divorce paperwork. The same community that was shunning Derek was embracing his family with protective generosity. Sophie and Ben were struggling with their father's absence in different ways. Ben's anger was obvious and direct. He'd overheard enough adult conversations to understand that his father had betrayed their family, and his 11-year-old sense of justice demanded clear villains and heroes. Derek's weekend visits were tense affairs, where Ben answered questions with minimal responses and avoided eye contact whenever possible. Sophie's confusion was harder to navigate. At 8 years old, she understood that Mommy and Daddy weren't living together anymore, but the concept of divorce and its permanence remained abstract. She missed her father's presence during bedtime routines and Saturday morning pancakes, but she also sensed the relief in her mother's demeanor now that Derek's critical comments and constant phone calls had ended. Derek's relationship with Amber was deteriorating under the stress of his changed circumstances. The confident, successful businessman she'd been attracted to had been replaced by an anxious, defensive man whose future looked increasingly uncertain. Their romantic weekends in Columbus hotels had been replaced by tense conversations about money and reputation damage that affected her career as well. Amber worked in the same real estate industry where Derek's reputation was collapsing. Colleagues who'd once respected her professional judgment were questioning her personal choices. The association with Derek was becoming a liability that threatened her own client relationships and career advancement. The affair that had seemed exciting and forbidden when Derek was a prosperous married man now felt sordid and destructive. Thursday brought the most devastating blow to Derek's professional standing. The Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce voted to revoke his membership, citing conduct unbecoming to community business standards. The decision wasn't just symbolic. Chamber membership provided networking opportunities, referral systems, and credibility markers that were essential for local business success. Without those connections, Derek's ability to rebuild his Cedar Falls client base was essentially eliminated. The vote wasn't close. Business owners who'd known Derek for years spoke about trust being the foundation of all commerce, and how someone who'd deceive his own wife couldn't be trusted with customer relationships. The discussion was painful and personal, with several members sharing their own experiences with Derek's changing attitude over recent years as his success had grown. Derek's desperation led to increasingly poor decisions. He called Lisa repeatedly, alternating between angry demands and tearful apologies. He showed up at her school during lunch break, causing a scene that required administrative intervention and embarrassed Lisa in front of her colleagues and students. His behavior was becoming erratic and unpredictable, further damaging his reputation and making reconciliation impossible. Legal proceedings moved forward with methodical efficiency. Lisa's attorney had built an ironclad case documenting Derek's financial deception and infidelity. The evidence was so overwhelming that Derek's own lawyer advised him to accept whatever settlement terms Lisa offered, rather than risk a contentious trial that would only increase his legal costs and public humiliation. The settlement negotiations revealed the full extent of Derek's financial manipulation. Beyond the hidden bank account, there were business credit card charges for personal expenses, falsified tax deductions for fictional business meetings, and investment account transfers that should have required Lisa's signature. Derek had been stealing from his own family for over 2 years, building a secret financial foundation for his planned divorce while Lisa trusted him completely. Friday evening, Derek sat in his sparse Columbus apartment reviewing bank statements that showed his rapid financial decline. His real estate business had collapsed entirely in Cedar Falls, and his Columbus prospects were limited by his damaged reputation and emotional instability. The comfortable lifestyle he'd built over 23 years of marriage was disappearing, and the future he'd planned with Amber seemed increasingly unrealistic. The lease ran for 6 months, but Derek was already calculating whether he could afford to stay even that long. His savings were depleting faster than anticipated, and new income sources were nowhere to be found. The affair with Amber had cost him his family, his business, his community standing, and now his financial security. Every aspect of his life was worse than it had been before he'd started planning his escape from marriage. Lisa spent that same Friday evening helping Sophie with a school project about family traditions. They were creating a poster about their favorite holiday memories, and Sophie insisted on including pictures from past Christmases that featured Derek. Lisa watched her daughter carefully cut around Derek's figure in several photos, not removing him entirely, but minimizing his presence in their family narrative. The weekend brought Derek's scheduled visitation with the children, but Ben refused to go to Columbus. His anger toward his father had hardened into permanent resentment, and Lisa didn't force the issue. Sophie went reluctantly, returning Sunday evening with stories about a sad apartment and a daddy who seemed confused about how to spend time with her without the familiar routines of their family home. Derek's isolation was becoming complete. His professional network had evaporated, his marriage was destroyed, his relationship with his children was strained, and even his affair was deteriorating under external pressures. The laugh during Maggie's eulogy had been the visible symptom of arrogance and disrespect that had deeper roots, but those roots were now exposed and withering under community scrutiny.
The man who had calculated every aspect of his divorce strategy had failed to account for the most important variable, the reaction of people who'd trusted him and been betrayed by his deception. Derek Rodriguez was learning that reputation and relationships couldn't be manipulated like financial assets, and that some consequences couldn't be avoided through clever planning or legal maneuvering. 2 weeks into December, Derek's financial situation reached a critical breaking point. His bank account showed a balance of $843, barely enough to cover his rent and utilities for another week. The hidden savings that were supposed to fund his new life with Amber had evaporated faster than winter snow under Ohio's weak December sun. His credit cards were approaching their limits, and his business line of credit had been frozen after the bank learned about his divorce proceedings and reputation problems. Amber delivered the final blow on a gray Tuesday afternoon. She appeared at his Columbus apartment unannounced, her usually perfect makeup streaked with tears and her professional composure completely shattered.
Her real estate firm had called her into a meeting that morning. The association with Derek was damaging her client relationships and affecting the entire office's reputation. Her supervisor had given her an ultimatum: end the relationship with Derek immediately or find employment elsewhere. "I can't lose my career for this," she sobbed, pacing the cramped living room of Derek's apartment. "My clients are asking questions I can't answer. Other agents won't work with me on deals. My commission is down 60% from last quarter because nobody trusts me anymore." Derek watched his carefully constructed future collapse in real time. The woman he'd sacrificed his family for was abandoning him just as his professional and financial foundations crumbled. Amber's decision was purely practical, but it felt like the ultimate betrayal after everything he'd given up to be with her. "You said we'd build a life together," Derek protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "I left my wife for you. I lost my children for you. You can't just walk away now." Amber's response was cruel in its honesty. "I didn't ask you to leave your wife. I didn't ask you to destroy your reputation or lose your business. Those were your choices, and I won't let your bad decisions ruin my life too." The apartment door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through Derek's empty rooms. He sank onto his second-hand couch, surrounded by the sparse furnishings that represented his new reality. The expensive suits hanging in his closet seemed absurd now, costumes for a role he could no longer afford to play. Derek's parents called from Phoenix that evening. His mother's voice carried disappointment and confusion as she tried to understand how their successful son had destroyed his marriage and career so completely. The conversation was painful and awkward, filled with long silences and careful questions that Derek couldn't answer honestly. "Your father and I don't understand what happened," his mother said quietly. "Lisa was such a lovely girl, and those children adored you. How could you throw all that away for someone you barely knew?" Derek couldn't explain his motivations because he no longer understood them himself. The affair with Amber had seemed exciting and liberating when his marriage felt routine and predictable. The prospect of starting fresh had appealed to his ego and his desire for validation. But facing the actual consequences of his choices, Derek realized he'd traded everything meaningful in his life for an illusion of freedom that had turned into isolation and despair.
Derek's obligation for child support would consume most of any future income, leaving him with barely enough to maintain basic living expenses. The legal fees alone had cost Derek over $15,000, money that came from his remaining savings and maxed-out credit cards. His attorney explained that fighting the settlement would have been futile, given the overwhelming evidence of infidelity and financial deception. Derek had essentially paid thousands of dollars to formalize his own destruction. Christmas approached with the inexorable momentum of a freight train Derek couldn't stop or avoid. His court-mandated visitation rights allowed him to see Sophie and Ben for 4 hours on Christmas Eve, but even that limited time felt like an insurmountable challenge. He had no money for meaningful gifts, no stable home to host them, and no emotional reserves left to pretend everything would be fine. Derek's Christmas Eve with his children was an exercise in mutual awkwardness. Sophie tried to maintain cheerful conversation about school and her friends, but her 8-year-old attempts at normalcy only highlighted how abnormal their situation had become. Ben remained sullen and unresponsive, answering questions with monosyllables and avoiding eye contact throughout their time together. The fast food restaurant where Derek took them for dinner was crowded with other families celebrating holiday traditions. Derek watched parents and children sharing laughter and excitement about Christmas morning, and the contrast with his own situation felt like a physical weight on his chest. He'd once been part of that world of family joy and anticipation. Now he was an outsider, looking in, excluded from the life he'd voluntarily abandoned.
When Derek returned the children to Lisa's house that evening, he caught a glimpse of the warm, welcoming home he'd lost. Through the front window, he could see the Christmas tree they decorated together, stockings hanging on the mantel where his had once belonged, and Lisa helping Sophie arrange cookies for Santa. The scene represented everything he'd destroyed in pursuit of something he couldn't even define anymore. New Year's Eve found Derek alone in his apartment, drinking cheap beer and scrolling through social media posts from his former life. Lisa had shared photos of a New Year's Day brunch with friends, Sophie and Ben smiling broadly as they played board games with children Derek didn't recognize. His former neighbors and colleagues were celebrating with their families, building memories and traditions that would last long after the holiday decorations were packed away. Derek's own year-end reflection was brutal in its clarity. 12 months ago, he'd been a respected businessman with a beautiful home, a successful marriage, and 2 children who looked up to him. He'd had financial security, community standing, and a future full of possibilities. The affair with Amber had seemed like an exciting addition to his already comfortable life, not a replacement for everything he valued. Now he sat in a shabby apartment with no career prospects, no savings, no meaningful relationships, and children who barely tolerated his presence. His reputation was destroyed, his professional network had evaporated, and his future looked increasingly bleak. The cost of his deception had been everything he'd worked to build over 23 years of adult life.
Lisa, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Teaching provided structure and purpose that had been missing during the chaotic final years of her marriage. Her students responded to her increased confidence and enthusiasm, and parents requested her specifically for their children's classroom assignments. The Cedar Falls School District had offered her additional responsibilities and a salary increase that improved her financial stability. The support from her community had evolved from crisis assistance to genuine friendship and mutual aid. Mrs. Chen had become a surrogate grandmother to Sophie and Ben, providing after-school care and homework help that allowed Lisa to focus on her teaching without worrying about childcare arrangements. Bob Harrison had taken on the role of grandfather figure, teaching Ben basic car maintenance and taking both children fishing on weekend afternoons. Derek's isolation was complete by February. His parents had stopped calling regularly after several uncomfortable conversations where Derek couldn't hide his bitterness and self-pity. His former friends avoided contact rather than navigate the awkwardness of maintaining relationships with both Derek and Lisa. Even casual acquaintances from his real estate career had moved on to other professional networks that didn't include his toxic presence. The man who'd laughed during his mother-in-law's eulogy had learned that disrespecting family bonds carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate relationships. Derek's assumption that he could control the narrative and minimize the damage to his reputation had been catastrophically wrong. His carefully planned exit strategy had become a public demonstration of character failure that destroyed every aspect of his former life. Sitting in his cramped apartment on a cold February evening, Derek finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost. The comfortable home, successful career, and loving family he'd abandoned hadn't been obstacles to his happiness. They had been the foundation of everything meaningful in his life. His pursuit of excitement and validation through deception had cost him everything he'd actually valued, leaving him with nothing but regret and the devastating knowledge that his choices had been entirely avoidable. Spring arrived in Cedar Falls with the promise of renewal that Derek could observe but not experience. From his furniture store job, he watched through plate glass windows as the community came back to life after Ohio's harsh winter. Families walked past on weekend afternoons, parents pushing strollers, while older children rode bicycles on sidewalks Derek had once considered his neighborhood territory. Now he was an outsider looking in, excluded from the rhythms of family life he'd voluntarily abandoned. His financial situation had stabilized at a barely sustainable level.
The furniture store provided enough income to cover his basic apartment rent and utilities, but child support payments consumed any possibility of rebuilding savings or improving his living situation. Derek had become familiar with generic groceries, second-hand clothing, and the careful budgeting required to survive paycheck to paycheck. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle he'd maintained for 2 decades now seemed like someone else's memory. Lisa's transformation continued in ways that surprised everyone who knew her. She'd enrolled in graduate courses to earn her master's degree in education administration, funded by scholarships and grants that recognized her academic potential and professional dedication. Evening classes required additional childcare arrangements, but the community network that had formed around her family provided support willingly and enthusiastically. Sophie and Ben had adapted to their new normal with the resilience that children often display during difficult transitions. Sophie's nightmares about losing their house had stopped, replaced by excitement about school projects and dance recitals that filled their calendar with positive activities.
Ben's anger toward his father had evolved into indifference, emotional distance that allowed him to focus on baseball season and friends who provided the male mentorship he no longer received at home. Derek's court-mandated counseling sessions revealed psychological patterns he'd never examined honestly. The therapist helped him understand that his affair hadn't been about dissatisfaction with Lisa or excitement about Amber. It had been about ego validation and the illusion of control over his own narrative. Derek had convinced himself that he deserved more excitement, more appreciation, and more recognition than his stable family life provided. The sessions were painful exercises in accountability that Derek initially resisted. Acknowledging his selfishness and poor judgment required admitting that his comfortable life had been destroyed by his own choices rather than external circumstances. The therapist wouldn't allow Derek to blame stress, midlife crisis, or Lisa's supposed neglect for decisions that had been calculated and deliberate. Memorial Day weekend brought an unexpected encounter that crystallized Derek's understanding of what he'd lost. While shopping for groceries at the discount store where he now did his weekly buying, he encountered Mrs. Chen in the produce section. She recognized him immediately, and her expression shifted from surprise to barely concealed contempt. "Derek Rodriguez," she said flatly, her voice carrying none of the warmth she'd once shown him during neighborhood conversations. "I heard you were still in the area." The brief exchange was polite but cold. Mrs. Chen mentioned that Lisa was doing wonderfully, that Sophie and Ben were thriving, and that the entire community was proud of how gracefully she'd handled her divorce. The subtext was clear. Derek had been forgotten and replaced in the narrative of his former family's life. Summer brought news that Lisa had been offered a promotion to assistant principal at Cedar Falls Elementary. The position represented professional recognition and financial security that would eliminate any dependency on Derek's child support payments. Lisa's success was built on her own merit and hard work, qualities that had always existed but had been overshadowed by Derek's dominant personality during their marriage. Derek's visitation weekends with Sophie and Ben became increasingly difficult as the children developed busy social schedules that didn't accommodate his limited availability. Ben's travel baseball team required weekend tournaments that conflicted with Derek's scheduled time. Sophie's dance competitions and birthday parties with school friends created natural priorities that didn't include visiting her father's cramped apartment. The children weren't deliberately excluding Derek, but their lives had naturally expanded to fill the space his absence had created. They had formed new routines, new relationships, and new sources of stability that didn't depend on his presence or participation. Derek realized he was becoming peripheral to their childhood development, a weekend obligation rather than a central figure in their daily lives. His former colleagues in Cedar Falls real estate had moved on completely. Derek occasionally saw familiar faces at coffee shops or grocery stores, but the conversations were brief and uncomfortable. Professional networking events that had once included him automatically now proceeded without any acknowledgement of his existence. The business community that had celebrated his success for over a decade had collectively decided he no longer deserved recognition or inclusion. By autumn, Derek's isolation was so complete that entire weeks passed without meaningful conversation beyond work-related interactions. His furniture store colleagues were friendly but distant, treating him as a temporary employee rather than someone worth investing in personally. His apartment neighbors were strangers who nodded politely in hallways but showed no interest in developing friendships. The anniversary of Maggie's death arrived in October with a significance Derek hadn't anticipated. He drove past Riverside Memorial Gardens on his way to work and saw fresh flowers on her grave, evidence that Lisa and the children continued to honor her memory with regular visits. Derek realized he hadn't visited Maggie's grave since the funeral, another indication of how completely he'd severed connections with his former life. Lisa's master's degree graduation ceremony took place on a crisp November morning. Derek learned about it through social media posts that showed Sophie and Ben beaming with pride as their mother received recognition for her academic achievement. The photos captured a family celebration at a restaurant Derek didn't recognize, surrounded by friends and supporters who had replaced him in Lisa's social circle. Christmas approached with the same inevitability as the previous year, but Derek's financial situation had improved enough to purchase modest gifts for Sophie and Ben. His court-mandated visitation remained limited to Christmas Eve afternoon, and the children's enthusiasm seemed genuine rather than obligatory. They had accepted their father's reduced role in their lives without bitterness, treating him with the polite affection reserved for distant relatives. Derek's Christmas Eve dinner with his children revealed how much they'd grown during the year of separation. Sophie discussed her advanced dance classes with confidence and passion. Ben described his baseball achievements with pride that didn't require his father's validation. Both children had developed independence and self-assurance that flourished without Derek's controlling presence. When Derek returned the children to Lisa's house that evening, he caught a glimpse of the life that continued without him. The Christmas tree was larger than he remembered, decorated with new ornaments that represented traditions he wasn't part of creating. Lisa appeared briefly at the front door, and Derek was struck by how confident and content she looked. The anxious, dependent woman he'd married had been replaced by someone who thrived on her own accomplishments and choices. Standing on his former family's front porch, Derek finally understood the complete magnitude of what his disrespectful laugh during Maggie's eulogy had cost him. That moment of arrogance and insensitivity had been the visible symptom of deeper character flaws that had destroyed everything meaningful in his life. His assumption that he could control the consequences of his betrayal had been catastrophically wrong. The divorce papers that Lisa had signed before Maggie's eulogy represented more than legal documents ending a marriage. They had been instruments of justice that restored dignity to a family Derek had taken for granted. His children were thriving without his daily presence. Lisa had discovered strength and success she'd never known she possessed, and the Cedar Falls community had moved forward without missing his contribution. Derek Rodriguez had learned that respect and trust couldn't be restored through apologies or regret. His laugh during his mother-in-law's eulogy had revealed his true character at the moment when concealment was impossible. The consequences that followed had been inevitable and appropriate, teaching him that some mistakes carry permanent costs that can't be negotiated away or minimized through clever planning. Walking back to his car in the December cold, Derek realized that his punishment had also been a form of liberation for everyone involved.
Lisa's family was healthier without his manipulation and control. His children were developing character without his negative example, and even Derek himself had been forced to confront truths about his personality that might have remained hidden indefinitely. The man who had disrespected Maggie Thompson's memory had paid the full price for his arrogance, but the family he'd betrayed had found something better than revenge. They had found peace, prosperity, and the kind of genuine happiness that couldn't be destroyed by someone else's poor choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.